I have lived long enough to know that a man is rarely what he appears when he steps off a wagon, and a woman rarely admits, not right away, not to herself, when she is judged too soon. That is the lesson I carry in my bones, worn smooth as riverstone, and I find myself returning to it most on winter evenings when the fire settles low, and the smell of wood smoke drifts through the room like a patient ghost. The year was 1887, and the town of Harlow Crossing, Colorado, sat along a wagon road that connected two mining camps with ambitions larger than their fortunes. It was not a grand town. It had a livery, a dry goods store, a barber shop that doubled as a dentist's office on Saturdays, and one boarding house, a wide two-story structure of whitewashed timber that stood at the road's gentle bend like a woman who had decided, despite everything, to keep standing. She had run that boarding house alone for 3 years by then. Her husband had died of a fever in the summer of 1884, leaving her the building, a modest debt, and the particular silence of a house full of other people's noise. She was 38 years old. She was capable and precise and had arranged her life around those two qualities because they had never failed her, while softer things had. She kept the rooms clean, the ledger accurate, the meals plain but filling. She was respected in Harlow Crossing, which is a different thing from being beloved, and she understood the difference. But the rooms had grown empty that autumn. The eastern mining camp had collapsed, a bad vein, a worse investor, and the traffic along the road had thinned like a late-season creek. November loomed, and with it, the cold that turned the mountain passes into walls. She needed help, not a hired hand. She could not afford wages. She needed something steadier. She had decided with the same cool arithmetic she applied to her ledger, a husband. She had written to an agency in Denver. She had been specific. She asked for a man of reasonable education, presentable manner, and experience in management or trade. She had used the word respectable 3 times in her letter, which told anyone who read carefully exactly what she feared. The agency had written back promptly. They had, they assured her, precisely the right man. A European gentleman, they said, experienced, reliable, arriving by the Harlow Road on the 4th of October. She had smoothed her best gray dress that morning. She had told herself it meant nothing. She had told her two remaining guests, a traveling salesman and an elderly surveyor, that she was merely expecting a business associate. She was standing on the porch when the wagon appeared around the bend, and the first thing she noticed, before the man himself, was the smell. Wood smoke, cured meat, something rich and foreign and entirely, thoroughly unexpected, drifting ahead of him down the road like an announcement she had not known how to read. The wagon came slowly, as if the horse pulling it had learned long ago that there was no use in hurrying. It was an old sorrel mare, thick through the chest, patient-eyed, and behind her swayed a modest flatbed loaded with things that made no immediate sense. She stood on the porch and counted them without meaning to. 2 barrels, dark-staved and sealed with wax at the lids. A wooden crate with slatted sides from which hung, on hooks, a row of what appeared to be sausages. Long, dark, glistening faintly in the pale October light. A canvas bundle tied with cord. A cast-iron pot nestled in straw, and a man. He was not what the word gentleman had promised. He was broad through the shoulders in the way that came from actual labor rather than the tailor's art of suggesting it. His coat was plain brown wool, worn at the elbows but cleanly brushed. His hat was low-crowned and practical. He had a face that had spent considerable time outdoors, not roughly weathered but settled, the way a barn door settles when it has been properly hung and has held for years through seasons of use. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a little older. His hands on the reins were large and unhurried. He drove with the quiet authority of a man who had driven many miles before and expected to drive many more. He drew the mare to a stop in front of the porch and looked at her, not with assessment, not with the evaluating sweep she had expected and half dreaded from a man who had traveled to meet a prospective wife. He looked at her the way a man looks at a place he has been told about, and is now, for the first time, seeing with his own eyes, measuring not her worth, but the fit of things. He climbed down from the wagon without rushing. He removed his hat. His hair was dark with threads of gray at the temples. He said his name clearly, with an accent that placed him somewhere in the German-speaking world, the syllables deliberate and unhurried, as if he had learned that American ears needed a moment to catch up. He said he believed she had been expecting him. He said this without the faintest suggestion of apology or nervousness, simply as a statement of shared fact between two people who had made an arrangement and were now standing at the beginning of it. From inside the front parlor came the sound of the traveling salesman's poorly suppressed laugh, not loud but audible. She felt the color rise in her throat, not in her face. She had too much practice holding her face still, but in that warm, involuntary place just below the jaw where embarrassment first announces itself, she said, evenly, that yes, she had been expecting him. She did not look at the sausages. She did not look at the barrels. She kept her eyes on his face, which remained entirely calm, and wondered if he had noticed the laugh, and knew from the stillness of him that he had. She stepped back and held the door open wider, which was, she supposed, invitation enough. He carried the first barrel himself, setting it against the entryway wall with a care that suggested he understood floors and their feelings about sudden weight. Then he went back for the second. The sausages he brought in last looped over one forearm like a tradesman's sample, which in a sense they were. She noticed, though she did not intend to, that he moved with an economy that was not hurry. Each trip to the wagon was purposeful, nothing wasted. No theatrical effort, no grunting for the benefit of observers. He simply moved things from outside to inside, as a man does when there is work to be done, and daylight is not a thing to spend arguing with. Mr. Fenwick, the salesman, had drifted to the parlor doorway. He was a man who traveled in patent medicines and thought himself a wit, which is a dangerous combination in a boarding house. He watched the second barrel come through the door, with an expression arranged to suggest that he was merely curious, not unkind, though she had lived long enough to know the difference was usually small, she told Mr. Fenwick that supper would be at 6, as always, and that the parlor fire wanted tending if he had nothing better to do with his hands. He took the hint with the grace of a man who had been redirected by landladies before, which is to say, he took it poorly but quietly, and retreated. She led the way through to the back of the house, to the kitchen and the room beside it that had been her husband's study, and was now the room she offered to help when she had help to offer. It was not large. It had a window that faced the alley and a hook on the back of the door and a rope bed with a reasonable mattress, and she had always considered it honest lodging for honest work. He set the sausages on the kitchen table and looked at the room without visible judgment. He looked at the stove, which was a good cast iron range that she kept in careful order. He looked at the larder door, left open, showing its shelves. He looked at the window briefly, as if checking the light. Then he turned and asked, in that measured and careful English of his, whether the kitchen was her sole domain during the day, or whether he might use it before the guests came down for breakfast. She told him she was generally there from 5 in the morning. He nodded as if this answered a question he had been carrying for some time, and said that 5 was agreeable, and that if she permitted it, he would have something ready before she needed the range for the eggs. She did not know exactly what to say to that. She had expected negotiation. She had expected, if she was honest, some small grievance about the room or the terms. She said that 5 o'clock would be fine, and left him to settle in. She did not sleep well that night. She lay listening to the silence from the end of the hall, no footsteps, no strange sounds, nothing to confirm her anxieties or ease them. The boarding house breathed around her the way it always did. A creak from the roof boards, the low knock of the wood stove cooling in the parlor, the faint stir of wind at the north window, ordinary sounds. Yet her mind kept circling back to the kitchen, to those barrels sitting squat and foreign on her clean floor, to the string of sausages draped across her second-best shelf, like something from a market in a city she had never visited. She rose at 4:15, as she sometimes did when sleep refused to stay. She wrapped her shawl and went down the back stairs, meaning to have the stove lit and the coffee on before anything else could complicate the morning. He was already there, not noisily, not in any way that announced itself. He had the stove lit. She could feel the warmth from the hall, and he was standing at the work table in the lamplight with his back to her, moving with the particular economy of a man who has worked in a kitchen long enough to stop thinking about it. The smell reached her before she found words. It was not a smell she had a ready name for. Onion, yes, and something deeper beneath it, something that reminded her of the smokehouse her father had kept when she was a girl in Ohio, except richer, more careful than that. Her father's smokehouse had been a practical thing. This smell was something else. It was, she thought with some irritation at herself for thinking it, the smell of someone who understood what they were doing. She said good morning. He turned, not startled, as if he had heard her on the stair. He wished her good morning in return and gestured briefly toward the coffee, which was already made and sitting at the back of the range where it would stay warm without burning. She poured a cup and stood near the door because it was still her kitchen, and she intended him to understand that, though she said nothing to that effect. She watched him work. He had one of the sausages cut into rounds in a cast iron pan she recognized as her own, and beside it a smaller pot with what appeared to be the pickled cabbage warming slowly. He had found the bread she had baked 2 days prior and cut it in slices of an even thickness that she had to admit were neater than her own. He did not explain himself as he worked. He did not narrate his intentions or make conversation that required her to respond. He simply worked, and the kitchen, which was hers and had always been hers, did not feel taken from her. It felt, if she was truthful in the privacy of her own thoughts, as though it were being helped. The coffee was good. She finished the cup before she meant to. She set the empty cup on the shelf by the door and watched him turn the sausage rounds with a fork, unhurried, the way a man turns something he has turned 10,000 times before and does not need to think about. The grease in the pan spoke quietly. The cabbage steamed. Outside, the early light was coming through the single east-facing window and laying itself across the plank floor in a long, pale stripe, and she noticed, not for the first time but more sharply now, how much that floor needed a good scrubbing. She poured a second cup of coffee, which she had not intended to do. The first of her guests came down before 7, which was earlier than usual. He was a drummer from St. Joseph who had taken the corner room and spent most of the previous evening complaining about the softness of the mattress, in a way that suggested the mattress was not the true source of his dissatisfaction. He came into the kitchen doorway in his suspenders and stopped. She watched him smell the air the way a dog smells something it was not expecting to find. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said he supposed breakfast was ready. She told him it would be on the table in 10 minutes and that he was welcome to wait in the front room. He did not go to the front room. He stood in the doorway and continued to smell the air, and she could not entirely blame him for it, because the smell was, she had to admit in the privacy of her own mind, remarkable. It was the smell of rendered pork fat and spice, of something fermented and warm and deeply savory, of bread toasting against the iron side of the range where he had leaned the slices to warm through. It was not the smell of the careful, modest breakfasts she had been setting out for the past 2 seasons, the thin oatmeal and preserved plum and bread that was nourishing enough but that no one had ever stood in a doorway on account of. By the time she carried the first plate to the table, 2 more guests were on the stairs. She had not called them. She had not rung the small bell she kept on the sideboard for that purpose. They had simply come the way people come toward warmth in January without being asked. She stood at the head of the table and watched them settle into their chairs with an attention they had not shown at her table before, and she felt something complicated move through her that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not quite gratitude. It was not quite resentment. It was somewhere in the narrow country between the two, where a person stands when they have been helped by someone they had not expected to help them, and they are not yet sure how to feel about the fact that they needed the help at all. He brought the plates from the kitchen without ceremony and set them down and went back for the next. The meal was a quiet thing, in the way that serious meals tend to be. There was not the loose, wandering conversation she was accustomed to managing at her table, the talk of roads and weather and the price of timber at the mill, but something more focused, the way a room goes when people are genuinely attending to what is in front of them. She heard the sound of bread being torn. She heard a man at the far end set down his fork and lift it again almost immediately, as though he could not quite bear the interruption. She moved between the kitchen and the table, refilling the water pitcher, replacing the bread plate when it emptied, performing the small domestic motions that had always been hers to perform. He had retreated to the kitchen once the plates were down, and she was grateful for that in a way she could not have articulated. She needed the dining room to feel like hers again, even if what filled it was entirely his doing. The man who had laughed in the yard, she knew him, a dry goods merchant who came through every 6 or 8 weeks with a full opinion of everything, cleaned his plate without a word, and then looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not effusive, it was simply honest, and somehow that was worse because she could not dismiss honesty the way she could dismiss flattery. "Ma'am," he said, and that was all, and he meant it as a compliment of the highest order. She nodded as though she had expected nothing less and went back to the kitchen. He was at the basin, working through the first of the pots with the same unhurried steadiness with which he seemed to do everything. The kitchen was warm and smelled of rendered fat and browned onion, and the faint sweet residue of the cabbage, and the 2 oil lamps on the shelf threw a low gold light across the room that made it look warmer than it was, or perhaps exactly as warm as it was, and she could not tell any more. She stood in the doorway a moment longer than she needed to. He did not turn around. He was not a man who required an audience for what he did, and she had noticed that about him from nearly the first hour. There was no performance in his labor. He worked as though the work itself were sufficient reason, as though no one watching were necessary to make the effort real. She moved to the sideboard and began to stack the returned plates. They worked in the same room without speaking, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a working silence, the kind that two people arrive at only after some shared effort has already settled between them like ground that has been turned over and is ready. For seed, she was adding up numbers in her head. 3 rooms occupied, the possibility, not certainty, but genuine possibility, of a fourth by morning. The ledger on the writing desk had not looked like that in a long while. She finished stacking the plates and carried them through to the kitchen, where the wash basin waited. He had already set a kettle on the stove before she arrived, anticipating the need without being asked, and the water was nearly hot. She poured it into the basin and began to wash, and she was aware of him moving behind her, banking the fire in the dining room, wiping down the long table with a damp cloth he had found on his own, returning chairs to their proper positions with a quietness that made the work seem almost ceremonial. She thought about the ledger. She could not help it. 3 rooms occupied and the strong likelihood of a fourth meant that by morning she would have the most tenants she had seen under one roof since the previous October, when a surveying party had come through and filled every bed for 4 nights running. That had been a stroke of fortune she had not repeated. What had happened tonight was different. Tonight, people had come not because they needed shelter and had nowhere else, the usual reason, but because word had moved through town the way wood smoke moves low and deliberate and reaching further than you expect. A man at one table tells another man. A woman buying flour mentions it to the woman behind her. By the time those travelers had climbed the porch steps, they had already been told what to expect, and what they found matched what they had been told, and that was a kind of reliability she had nearly forgotten her establishment could offer. She finished washing and stood drying her hands with a rough towel and looked out the small window above the basin. The street outside was dark except for the lantern post 2 doors down, which threw a long amber stripe across the mud. The night had grown cold. She could feel it coming in around the window frame. He came into the kitchen and set the tablecloth he had been carrying by the door. "The dining room is ready for morning," he said. She nodded. She turned to say something ordinary, something about the time, about locking the front door, about what he might need for breakfast preparation, and found that what came out instead was quieter than she intended. "They talked about it," she said. "Out there. Before they came in, I heard two of them on the porch saying they had heard there was something worth eating here tonight." He received this without expression, but not without attention. He was listening in the way he always listened, as though what you said mattered enough to be held carefully before he responded. "Good food travels," he said simply. It was not boastfulness. It was the same plain accounting of fact with which he seemed to approach most things. She folded the towel over the basin's edge and looked at him directly for a moment. "We need to talk about tomorrow," she said. He met her eyes and nodded once, and there was in that small gesture something she had not expected to find in any arrangement made on paper and sent. Through the mail there was steadiness in it. They sat at the kitchen table after the last lamp in the dining room had been turned low, not across from each other in any formal sense. She at one end, he nearest the stove where the banked fire still gave off warmth, but close enough that their voices could stay quiet without strain. This was new. In the weeks since his arrival, they had spoken at the door of the kitchen over a list in passing through the hall. They had not sat together in the low hour of a finished evening and talked about what came next. She had a small ledger open before her and a stub of pencil. He had nothing in front of him except his folded hands. "Tonight we had 11 at the table," she said, not looking up from the page. "3 weeks ago we had 4. 2 of those were regular boarders who had nowhere else to go." She tapped the pencil against the edge of the book. "I am not a woman who pretends figures are not figures." He did not pretend otherwise. He waited. "If we can hold 12 regularly, 12 paying suppers, 5 nights of the week, the rooms begin to sustain themselves." She said it with the careful flatness of someone who had spoken the number many times in private before speaking it aloud. That has not happened in 2 years. He looked at the stove, thinking. Then he said, "The bread." She glanced up. Tonight the bread ran short before the last table. 3 men at the end, they had none. He said this without accusation, only notation. If there is bread enough and it is warm, men will come back for that alone before they think of anything else. Bread and a hot plate. They do not need it to be fancy. They need it to be there. She wrote something in the margin of the ledger, not a word, a number. "You would need flour," she said, "more than I have been buying." "Yes, and the second smoker." She set the pencil down. "You have been talking around it for 10 days, the small one you built at the back of the yard. You want to build a larger one." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought she saw something careful in his expression. Not embarrassment exactly, but consideration. He was deciding whether to ask plainly or to work toward it by degrees. He chose plainly. "A proper smokehouse. I can build it with what is already on the property and 2 loads of lumber. I know what it costs. I know what it would return." He met her eyes. "It would not be for tomorrow. It would be for the cold months. For the men who pass through when the road is hard, and they want something that holds." She looked at him for a long moment in the low light. She thought of all the paper promises that had arrived in envelopes before him, the careful sentences, the enumerated qualities. She picked up the pencil again. "Show me what you need," she said. He pulled the pencil from her hand. Not roughly, not at all, just taking it the way a man takes a tool when he knows exactly what he means to do. With it. And he turned the ledger to a blank page near the back. She watched him draw. Not numbers first. Lines. A square with a pitched roof. Dimensions marked at each wall. A door placement. A vent at the ridge. He knew where the wind came from in this valley. She could see it in how he positioned the opening, north-facing, to pull the smoke up and through without letting weather push back in. She had lived on this property 11 years, and she had never thought about where the wind came from. She had simply endured it. He wrote the lumber list in 2 columns. What he could salvage from the woodpile behind the far shed, the boards from a collapsed partition she had been meaning to haul to the mill, and what he would need to buy new. The new lumber came to less than she expected. She started to say so and stopped herself, because she realized it wasn't luck. He had designed it around what was already there. "The stone," he said, tapping the corner where he had sketched the fire pit. "There is a dry creek bed on the east side of your property. It floods in spring. I know. Before it does, there is good flat stone." He looked at her. "I would collect it before the first hard freeze." She studied the page. She turned it slightly so the lamplight fell at a better angle, and she went over the numbers the way she had learned to go over numbers. Slowly, without assumption, looking for the place where hope had hidden a cost. She did not find one. The materials were honest. The labor was his own. She thought about what it would mean to have smoked meat available through January and February, when the road north turned to mud and then to ice and travelers stopped in, not because her sign was welcoming, but because there was simply nowhere else. She thought about those men sitting down to something that had been prepared with genuine skill, something that tasted like intention rather than necessity. "How long to build it?" she asked. 3 weeks if the weather holds. 4 if it doesn't. She looked at the calendar hung near the window. They had perhaps 6 weeks before the ground hardened. He had thought about that too, she suspected. He had waited until the timing was right to ask. She took the pencil back from him. She did not add anything to his drawing. She simply wrote a figure at the bottom of the page, what she could put toward lumber, and turned the ledger back to face him. He looked at the number, then he looked at her. He nodded once, and that was the agreement. He built it the way he did everything else, without announcement. She noticed the changes each morning before she had finished her first cup of coffee. A trench appeared along the south wall of the outbuilding, narrow and deliberate, exactly where he had drawn it. Then posts, set plumb and tamped firm, while the ground was still soft enough to work. Then the framing, which went up faster than she had expected, the angles clean and square, in a way that told her this was not his first structure of its kind. He worked before breakfast and after supper, in the gray hours when the light was barely enough, and she found herself waking earlier than she needed to, not to check on him, but simply because the sounds of his labor had become part of the morning. The tap of a mallet, the drag of a crosscut saw, the particular silence that followed when he stopped to measure something twice before cutting it once. Her guests noticed too. 2 of the railroad men who stayed a full week on account of a delayed supply shipment took to watching him from the porch after the supper dishes were cleared. They did not offer to help, but they stopped talking when they watched, and she thought there was a kind of respect in that quiet. One evening she brought him a lantern and a plate of bread and cold beef. He was fitting the interior shelving, the rails that would hold the smoking racks, and he had shavings in his hair and sawdust on his forearms. He took the plate without embarrassment and ate standing, looking at the work still ahead of him with the calm expression of a man who is never surprised by the distance remaining because he has always known it exactly. She asked him once, in that same quiet hour, where he had learned to build a smokehouse. He answered without setting down his bread. His father had built one in the old country. Then he had helped a man in Pennsylvania build one 2 years after he arrived. Then he had built his own, briefly, before circumstances had moved him west again. He did not explain what those circumstances were, and she did not ask. There was a shape to that sentence, a pause before, west again, that told her the brevity had not been his preference. She left him to his work and carried the lantern back toward the house. The night was cold and clean, the sky enormous the way it only gets in October when the air has finally dried out after the rains. She could see her breath. She could hear faintly the sound of him returning to the shelving. She had stopped counting the weeks she had managed alone before he arrived. She was not sure, standing there in the cold yard, with the lantern throwing yellow light across the frost-stiffened grass, that the number still mattered the way it once had. November came in hard that year, the way it sometimes does in that part of Colorado. Not gradually, with cold mornings and warm afternoons to ease you toward it, but all at once, a single night dropping the temperature 20 degrees and leaving the water barrel with a skin of ice by dawn. She had seen winters like it before. She had also seen what a winter like it could do to a boarding house that was not yet full, not yet proven, still earning back the reputation that 3 bad seasons had worn away. But something had shifted. She felt it in the way the guests moved through the dining room now, unhurried, leaning back in their chairs, asking questions about what was in the pot, rather than calculating how quickly they could leave. A freighter from Pueblo had stayed 4 nights instead of one. A circuit judge who had previously favored the hotel at the end of the main road had quietly appeared at her door with his traveling bag and a request for her quieter back room. She had given it to him without a word about why he'd changed his mind. She already knew. The word spreading through the territory was not about her boarding house exactly. It was about what was being served there. Smoked meats that held their flavor through a long day of riding. A sausage no one had tasted west of Kansas City. A supper table that actually smelled like supper. He had not advertised it. He had not put a single painted sign on the road. He had simply cooked, morning after morning, evening after evening, with the same unhurried attention he brought to every task, and the smell had done the work his words never would have. She watched him one afternoon from the kitchen doorway while he sliced portions with the large knife he kept with a care she had, initially found unsettling and now found quietly reassuring. He moved without wasted motion. He knew where each thing was before he reached for it, because he had arranged each thing himself and then not moved it. She thought about the man she had imagined arriving, the gentleman from the advertisement, the pressed collar, and the soft hands and the vocabulary of polite intentions. She had wanted, she now understood, not a partner but a presentation. Something to show the town, a dignity she could wear on her arm the way another woman might wear a brooch. What she had received instead was a man who had built her a smokehouse and restocked her cellar and turned her empty rooms into something people traveled an extra half-day to reach. She was not sure, standing in that doorway, watching him work in the low afternoon light that came through the single west-facing window, that she had ever in her life been so thoroughly corrected by events. She picked up a towel and began to dry the plates. He did not look up. She did not need him to. They worked like that until supper was laid. And then they worked like that through supper, and then through the cleaning of it, and somewhere in the ordinary rhythm of those hours, she stopped waiting for the moment to mean something and understood that it already did. The last guest retired early. The house settled into its particular nighttime sounds. The tick of the stovepipe, cooling, the shift of a horse in the far stall, the low complaint of a board near the back door that it always needed shimming and that she had noted twice in her ledger under repairs deferred, and that he had simply shimmed one morning without mention. She had noticed. She had not said anything at the time, and neither had he, and she had come to think of that small, unremarked exchange as a kind of language they were still learning to speak aloud. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at his end of the table. He came in from the porch, where he had been checking the smokehouse latch against the wind, and he sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup the way a man does when he has worked a long day and the warmth of an ordinary thing feels like a considerable gift. She sat across from him. Outside, a late October wind moved through the cottonwoods along the lane, and the lamp between them held its small, steady light. She said what she had been carrying since the afternoon. She told him she had been wrong. Not about the arrangement, not about the terms, but about what she had believed a man needed to be in order to deserve her trust. She told him she had built a very precise and very foolish idea of respectability, and that he had not argued with it or tried to dismantle it. He had simply gone on being himself until her idea collapsed of its own poor construction. She said she was not a woman who found it easy to say such things, and that he ought to understand the saying of them cost her something, and that she was paying it willingly. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the cup, and then he looked up and said that he had arrived with very little, and had not expected much, and that she had given him something no other place in this country had yet seen fit to give him, which was a fair chance honestly kept. He said that was not a small thing. He said he did not intend to forget it. The wind moved through the cottonwoods again. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his palm up and held on. Outside, the lamp above the porch door swung gently in the dark, lighting the lane for anyone still coming, as it had every night since the place first opened, as it would for a long time yet.